And welcome to the Cedar Falls Committee of the Whole meeting this January 7, 2019. And I'd like to call this meeting to order. And we have the usual suspects up here for committee, except we are joined by, I believe, 4 or 5 of our planning and zoning members. It's a unique meeting a couple times a year. We do try to get together for various topics that we would be covering. Tonight we happen to be covering as one of 2 items on the agenda the Capital Improvements Program, or CIP, joint meeting. We're also going to cover bills and payroll. So for the given audience, I'll call up Jennifer and give us an overview of the CIP.
Thank you, Mayor. Nothing says, Happy New Year than get to talk about the CIP, right? One of the things that all of you should have received, planning and zoning members included, is a book that it has the summary sheet in there on the CIP. It has sheets in there, detailed sheets about each of the projects, and then it also has a list of things that didn't make the list, so there are unmet needs. So one of the things I wanted to do tonight was really just go through some highlights, but obviously this kind of has all the detail of the book. And then at the end, I'm going to highlight maybe a dozen or so projects, but then if there's questions at the end about specific projects, obviously I got experts in the audience who can help me from the other departments about some of the projects if anyone has specific questions. So one of the things just wanted to start off with is just to talk about the CIP is a planning document and doesn't authorize or fund projects. Funding of the projects will be coordinated with the annual budget process. So every year we do this process, and again, some projects stay, maybe they get fine-tuned with numbers, sometimes projects go off because something else comes on. So again, it is really a planning document. You'll see that there's 210 projects. So again, we won't be covering them all tonight, but at least a few of them. And you can see they total over $282 million. There's 40 different funding sources identified on the CIP. One of the things when we're developing the CIP is we're trying to incorporate the city council goals when we're doing that. There's been some things that I think for current council and over the years that have been very important is infrastructure maintenance, making sure our street, sewer, stormwater, that we're doing that. There's also some of the things that were talked about in goal setting was how were projects going to be funded by flood reserve dollars. Things that were also discussed at goal setting were permeable alley, or maybe they were discussed at some various committee meetings, annual street repair program, and obviously, council goals of some major street reconstructions are on the CIP as well. The other thing we do is we try to incorporate the council's goal of base GO funding, which stands for general obligation. That's when we sell bonds to fund projects. And so we incorporate the goal of only having projects on the CIP that are funded by GO that offset what we're paying off for debt each year to try to keep our property tax rate even. We also want to maintain 25 to 30% of our debt capacity. And just as a reminder to everyone, our debt capacity is 5% of our assessed value. And so we want to make sure we're always protecting at least a little bit of that reserve. Other things is I think there's been interest over the years or questions by people about quality of life projects. Sometimes we get caught up in what are all the infrastructure and the things that are really needed, but what's also important are the quality of life projects. So there's approximately $15 million on the CIP, which maybe sounds like a small percentage in comparison to that big number I just said a little bit ago, but you also have to keep in mind that usually quality of life project means we have to use general obligation bond funding, or maybe private donations, or hotel motel taxes. So sometimes they're more challenging, I guess, to fund. So with that, just kind of a little bit of overview, I just want to get in again to some highlights of some detailed projects. So one of the first ones I'm going to show is the Cedar River recreational bank improvements. It's actually 2 separate projects on the CIP. It's broken out into the bank improvements and then broken out into in-river items. And you'll see on the CIP that the timing of it is in FY22 and 23. In summarizing what the funding sources are for that project, you'll see it's a total project cost between the two of $3.8 million. We'll use general obligation funding of $700,000, Black Hawk Gaming grant of $1.3 million, flood reserve of $1 million, and private donations of $800,000. For the council, you guys know that you spent a lot of time in goal setting, kind of coming up with what those parameters were. What are we going to use, or what's the target for the private? What's the flood reserve amount that we're going to use? And so obviously there was a lot of discussion about that. And then, as I mentioned, we would apply to gaming then for a gaming grant for this project. Next project is South Main Street parking lot. It's not a high dollar amount, but there's been some interest at some of our council meetings about the project, so I thought I would just mention it. And so you'll see that it's scheduled for FY20 with a project cost of $60,000 and coming out of the general obligation bond funding. So this is the small parking lot adjacent to South Main for trail accessibility. As part of this project, I think they're also going to try to construct a shoulder along South Main Street, and again, I just know there's been some interest in that project. Annual street repair program. It may sound, you know, we always talk about it, but I think it's a very important project that we have every year at the city, so again, wanted to mention it. You'll see in total, it's around $21 million, that line item on the CIP. We get about $5 million a year in local option sales tax. And just a reminder, that's been around since 1992. I looked that up about when we first did our local option sales tax. Number 69, Cedar Heights Drive reconstruction. Timing, we have FY18 to 22. So the total project cost on the CIP is estimated at $5.9 million. Again, you'll see general obligation bond funding of $650,000. We had a federal grant we received through Intercog for $2.9 million. It had used local option sales tax of $1.5 million, and then we have some road use tax and Cedar Falls utility funding in there. Oftentimes when we're doing a street, you know, we might be doing the utilities at the same time. So obviously we have some dollars in there from CFU as well. And this is actually reconstructing Cedar Heights from Green Hill to Viking. It was last constructed in 1983. Center Street improvements. Timing is fiscal year 20. Total project cost of $1.3 million. Just a reminder, this is really focusing on streetscape improvements. It's not resurfacing or reconstructing the street. So we show some general obligation funding of $150,000, local option sales tax of $100,000. We would look to apply to gaming for a grant for $300,000. In goal setting, we also talked about flood reserve dollars and funding that project through flood reserve, and then again, there's some CFU dollars in there as well. As I said, Mayor, I'm just going to keep rolling along. We can do questions at the end. Is that okay?
Or otherwise, folks speak up if there's some
Sure.
questions specifically.
So West First Street, number 87. Timing is FY18 to FY20. Total project cost of $15 million. Obviously, a big chunk of that is the state of Iowa paying for that, $8.1 million. We have some general obligation funding of $600,000, local option sales tax of $3.8 million. And again, we have some sewer and CFU in there for some utility costs. You've heard a lot about kind of wrapping up a lot of the right-of-way acquisition as it relates to that project. The city's been working on that. I think they're shooting for a bid letting in February, unless that's changed. And then again, we'd be looking at, you know, over 2 construction seasons. I put number 92, downtown streetscape, but actually 78 and 91 are also related to this project. So you'll see it's the timing of FY19 to 22. So between those 3 projects, it's a total cost of $4.4 million. We'd be looking at using the TIF from downtown to fund $2.8 million of it. Apply for a gaming grant of $1.3 million. We're actually going to do an application to them. I think Stephanie's getting ready here in January to go to them, and we'd be looking at doing like a 2-phase application with them. Also, Community Main Street would have some dollars in this, as well as Cedar Falls utilities. And just a reminder to people that it is going to reconstruction of 2nd Street, State to Main, 3rd Street, State to Washington, and then streetscaping out onto Washington, State Street, 2nd, 3rd, and 6th. Public safety building. It's under construction right now. Total project cost of $10.2 million. As you are well know, that we did use general fund savings of $9.5 million and got a gaming grant for $750,000. I think they're still hoping for getting it moved in and opening in July, August, so I think they're still using that for a target date. One of the things I just wanted to mention too, that you'll see on the CIP that we've kind of been talking about in conjunction to this project is once police moves out of City Hall, there's a line item on the CIP for repurposing City Hall. I think we know it's a good time to look at what are some improvements we can make at City Hall. We've been talking about carpet replacement for a few years. It's been holding in there for 18 years, which is probably a little surprising, but we thought, isn't that a good time to also look at why try to do carpet if we're going to try to do some repurposing? So we're going to be looking at, I think staff's just starting to get together to talk about maybe what are some things that we'd like to do with that project, what are some wants maybe we have, and then kind of go from there to see, we'd probably know more in a year from now maybe what kind of dollars we'd be actually talking about on the CIP for that.
So is that not listed on the CIP at all then?
It is on the CIP.
Like just further down?
Sure.
Okay. It's a, I will get to it, I'm sure.
Okay, all right. So number 104 and 105, industrial park expansion. We have timing of 19 to 22. We obviously have been purchasing some land, as you know, but we also like to just put a placeholder on our CIP too, that if those opportunities come up, that we can look at those. One of the things that we oftentimes have to do when we do purchase land for our industrial park is a lot of times we'll have to cash flow it until the TIF revenues then are received. So, you heard things about where we were, maybe going to be purchasing the land out of, and that we would eventually get TIF dollars to reimburse for that. Inclusive play park, I know this is one that you've heard a lot about, so this isn't new, but I think it's always an interesting one to highlight. So see the timing of FY 18 to 20, total project costs of around $1 million. Did receive a gaming grant of $250,000, private donations of over $700,000, and then we'd have the city's contribution. I believe tonight we're setting the hearing for those plans and specs for the next council meeting. I think maybe they've actually started some work on some restrooms there too. Roundabout landscape improvements, timing FY 21 to 23. What this is really doing is expanding some of our landscaping in our current roundabouts and looking whether we want to do some of that in some of our other ones. The funding source really is going to depend where the roundabout may exist, whether it would qualify under TIF or if we'd have to use road use tax dollars to do that. Number 152, street tree replacement. Again, this isn't a big dollar amount, but I think why we wanted to mention it is we're budgeting $15,000 a year in it because you've heard a lot about emerald ash borer. We've been removing some trees, have had crews out about that. So, then we're, going to be in the process of how are we going to replace some of those trees. So the parks have been working on that. Another project on the CIP that I know Councilman Blanford had an interest in and had some discussion about was whether it was time to maybe update our parks and public lands master plan. So we put in there a timing of FY 20 and 21 and a project cost of $100,000. I think, one of the things that Mark Ripplinger would tell you is that, it's probably just time. The last one was done in 1996, and obviously we've had changes in the north due to buyouts, we've had expansion to the south and west. People's just really recreational preferences have changed as well. So probably time to work on that. And it is out of general fund dollars, so when we're doing the budget for FY 20, you'll see that as one of the items we'll be listing in the budget. 192 is the Lloyd Lane recycling site expansion, FY 20. It's the second highest volume site, and so want to look at enlarging the site and adding additional containers. So that will come out of our refuse fund for $125,000. Another project, our new fire truck. We actually just took possession of it last week. There's in the CIP is $500,000 from general obligation bond funding. There will be some additional funding coming out of the budget as it relates to some of the equipment that has to go on the truck, et cetera. So that's some of the individual projects, but one of the things I just wanted to talk about kind of more in general, because they're important, I guess, is stormwater projects. We have 18, I didn't list any of them specifically, but we have 18 projects on the CIP that use stormwater funding. It totals $3.5 million on the CIP. One of the things as staff was developing the CIP and looking at what projects are needed, we knew that stormwater rates probably aren't going to cover everything we need. So we actually had to move some of those projects needed to be funded by general obligation bond funding instead of stormwater. One of the things we also did was add funding in there, as I mentioned, about permeable alleys. So we'll be looking at doing 3 alleys a year compared to 1. And just a reminder to council that the council did approve a 4-year rate increase this past year. So stormwater rates will be increasing 5% each year for the next 4 years. But as I said, there really was a lot of needs for stormwater. So I think we're going to continue to have to monitor those rates and continue to look at what projects we can fund on the CIP. Other big area is sewer. 21 projects on the CIP that use sewer revenue fund or sewer bond funding. Some of the big projects, nutrient removal, digester rehab, Oak Park line. Now you'll see this number's a little bigger than stormwater, and it's $58 million on the CIP. Now some of those are, kind of unknown numbers, but again, just kind of projecting out what we think those might be in a few years. The council did approve a 3-year rate increase this past year, so 5% each year for the next 3 years. And the CIP and large sewer bond sales will, continue to have effect on rates. That's one of the things that we looked at when we approved the sewer rate increases is knowing we may have some very large projects on the horizon. We wanted to look at, can we have, small increases over several years instead of going with no increases and then all of a sudden you have a 50% increase in your rates. So one of the things that with our last rate increase is trying to build up some of those reserves so we can pay for those large projects and again not have a huge rate increase in the year that we're trying to do that. One of the things I wanted to just mention too is TIF projects. Projects related to the new South Cedar Falls TIF area, so that was a new funding source on our CIP this year. Also continue to have projects in our existing TIF districts. Just kind of looking at overall funding sources is, this pie chart kind of breaks down where a lot of those funding sources are. So you'll see, intergovernmental revenues, those could be federal, state grants that we get, general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, and then we might have other funds. And the other funds would be where local option sales tax comes in, sewer monies, refuse money, stormwater, et cetera. So one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was about, goal of reserving capacity. Now, fortunately for Cedar Falls, that's not really a big concern right now. As you can see by this chart, what we do is we take our existing outstanding debt, we add in the bond sales on the CIP to find out, okay, how much of our debt capacity will we be using? So you can see that it really kind of stays right around that 10, 9, 11%. And again, why it stays somewhat consistent is the whole thing of trying to issue replacement debt. As we're not selling more than what we're paying off. So you can see we have plenty of capacity. We would have like 90% capacity that we would have in our debt limit. One of the other things we look at is how does it affect our tax rate, because that's what we're trying to do. So when we put that in here, we'll project out what that would affect property taxes, and it's less than 2% over 5 years. Again, that reinforces that goal of replacement debt, but that also assumes we don't have any growth. So it's a very conservative projection that we're doing when we do that. Just one other slide on the process before we get to if there's any questions. So overview and questions tonight for the process. And then what we'll do is next council meeting in 2 weeks, we'll have the actual formal public hearing on the CIP, and then council will do the actual formal approval on that night, January 21st. And then once that's approved, we will take the FY20 column and actually put it into the budget, since we'll be starting to work on our FY20 budget. So again, that's some highlights, a little bit about the process, and then if there's specific questions people have tonight, we're happy to answer those, or if after tonight you have questions, obviously feel free to contact myself or staff, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Jennifer. Any questions from council or P&Z commission members? Mr. Miller?
Jen, if you would, can you go through, just as a refresher on the flood reserve funds? That name's kind of deceiving for some
Sure.
folks, and just go through some of the
Sure.
background on it.
And I'm kind of having trouble breaking my old habits yet, still calling it flood reserve dollars. But one of the things that we did in goal setting was also talk about, is it really just flood reserve dollars, or is it emergency fund dollars? We could have lots of things that might happen here that we might need those reserve dollars for. So one of the things, and people may say, well, where does that come from? And maybe that's what you're getting at, Mark, is, you know, as we have disasters and we get reimbursements from FEMA, there's some things that they do reimburse us for, like administrative costs or staffing costs, that we pay for out of our general fund anyway, or the fund that those employees are paid out of. So what we do is, we have, over the years, whether it's 93, 99, 08, 16, is when we get some of those, we've just put them in a reserve fund. And why that's been important to us is that you never know whether we're going to get FEMA reimbursement, or there's times we have to spend out a lot of dollars before we even get our first dollar from FEMA. So through the goal setting, we talked about what's in the flood reserve fund, and what do we feel that is an amount we should be saving in that reserve fund, and then are there projects on the CIP that we can utilize those funds for. So I think what we talked about was trying to reserve in that $1.5 to $2 million in the fund, and then allowing, you know, other projects to be funded through the CIP. Does that help, Mark? Or?
Perfect.
Okay.
I have one more question, if you would.
Sure.
Stormwater funds, you mentioned that that permeable alley program's been pretty popular, at least in Ward 1 for certain, but from the preliminary to our, what's up for approval in CIP, it looked like there was like $2 million that was taken out of that. Is that because it's a wish list to reality, or?
Yes. That's the easy answer, is,
Sure.
I think we were trying to see, could we try to do 4 alleys in a year and put funding in? But as I mentioned, when staff sat down, the Stormwater Fund has challenges, just from the standpoint of there's so many needs out there, and what did we feel like we could afford? And that's one of the things we thought, well, maybe, you know, when sitting down and prioritizing, okay, what are the things we really need to do? And that was one we're like, well, maybe we can do 3 alleys instead of 4. That we still have the program going, we've still increased it, but maybe not quite to the total one
Sure.
that we had.
And then I noticed as well that we've got asphalt paving on select alleys as well. I don't know, maybe that's for Stephanie, but it seemed like, I don't remember what line item it is, but at least a couple years out, we're looking at doing some asphalt paving as well.
Right, I think there's some alleys, and like you said, I might need help from Stephanie or Chase is here, is that I think there's some that they know probably have to be asphalt paving. So I don't know, Stephanie, if you went to, or Chase?
I think Municipal Operations and Programs submitted some funding to try to help with some that they're regularly maintaining, and maybe we look at doing some asphalt alleys as well.
Thank you.
Mr. Burr?
Going back, Jennifer, to the emergency funds,
Sure.
using them for a non-emergency, how will we replenish that? I know we talked
Sure.
about it before, but can you remind me?
Sure. Well, I don't know that we came to a final decision in goal setting, but I think we talked about options. You know, and one of them is we can, as we develop the budget every year, we could determine whether we want to try to increase our budget and have a number that we want to then target to set aside each year to try to build that back up. That's one way we could do it. The other way would be is, I think in talking about emergency fund, is there was some discussion about, do we really need it? You know, or do we have other funds that could, if needed, cash flow before we receive FEMA dollars? So I know that was a couple of the things we talked about. Maybe you're thinking of one that I didn't remember, but those were, I know, some of the things we talked about in that.
Yeah, my concern was simply that it was going to deplete it down to,
True.
and wondered how are we going to put it back?
True, there's no, like, there's not like there's an annual revenue that goes in there, you're correct.
Mr. Cruz?
Jennifer, I noticed on a number of these projects, the gaming grant money is a pretty large portion. How reliable are we in getting that money? If there's a big recession and gaming revenue for the casino drops, how do we qualify? There's a variety of projects here that are getting the money. Is it broken down in different categories? Can you explain
Sure.
that and elaborate on that?
Well, one of the things that we do at Cedar Falls that we try to provide the Gaming Commission each year is kind of our scheduled asks. You know, kind of what do we think, we're taking the CIP, what do we think we're going to ask for over the next 3, 4, 5 years? And why we do that, I think gaming finds that helpful, so they kind of know, okay, what do we think Cedar Falls is going to be coming to the table to ask for? I think they're interested in funding what they might call some, I'll use the word legacy, but I don't know if that's the right word. But, you know, they're wanting to fund some pretty, I think, projects that are identifiable. Now, you're absolutely right. There's no guarantee. So when we identify those in the CIP, which kind of goes back to my very first thing about that's why it's a planning document. You know, if we applied for a grant and didn't get it, that's going to change how we're now going to plan for that project. It might reprioritize, you know, if the council feels that's still the #1 project, we're going to have to reprioritize other projects to get there. So you're right, it's not a guarantee, we're just being hopeful at this point, so, and then we'll move forward from there.
So to learn more about this process, how far in advance do you have to apply, go through the process, and then say,
Sure.
okay, here's the money? Or is
We
there-
have, twice a year, they have application process. It used to actually be quarterly, now it's twice a year. So usually what we're doing right now, you heard me say the streetscape. So Stephanie's just getting ready to do an application to the gaming right now for the streetscape. A lot of times they'll want a letter of intent 3 months to 6 months ahead of the actual application. So that's a little bit about the process. So we do kind of have to project, I mean, it's not an easy, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's not an easy, like, we have to submit it 6 months before the project starts. Now, one of the things that we do sometimes have to worry a little bit about is a lot of times when they grant it, we'll have like a 1 year to complete the project. So there has been times, sometimes we've had to go back and say, hey, due to some circumstances, you know, we need an extension, and that's not usually been a problem. So that's a little bit how that works. I don't know if I answered.
So when we, when we apply, do we apply for as much as we can get? Or if you want $500,000 and they say, well, we're only going to give you
Sure.
250?
Well, they have some general parameters they've tried to give us in terms of, you know, probably don't want to fund projects more than 50% of the cost of the project. We tend to, staff been targeting maybe more in the 35 to 40% on the max end, I would say. So, you know, we know we're not going to go and get something 100% funded. I think, you know, one of the things that gets to be a challenge with the gaming grants too is just that whole timing, and I'll pick the river as the perfect example because we talk about a goal setting. You know, sometimes it's hard to, how do you try to start a private fundraising thing when you don't know if you have the gaming grant? And gaming wants to know what you're going to have for matching dollars before they want to give you the grant. So sometimes what's hard is how do you kind of time that and what's really coming first? Because everyone kind of wants to know what's being funded. So that's sometimes what's the challenge.
And then we're competing against how many other entities that want money also?
Well, we'd be looking at all really governmental agencies in Black Hawk County.
Okay.
So you have, you know, City of Waterloo, you have, you know, City of Evansdale, Elk Run, schools, really property tax entities that we would be competing against. Yeah.
Anyone else? Mr. Blanford?
Director Rodenbeck, first of all, thank you to you and your staff for the time that you put in. I know we go through this every year, and I always appreciate it. Can you just do a quick run-through as a refresher for everyone of what our fiscal year is versus calendar year and
Sure.
how we do our budget process?
Sure. So our fiscal year is July 1st to June 30th. So one of the things that oftentimes people think, well, why are you already starting the budget in December? You know, well, really, we have to have it certified by March 15th to the state. So we're really looking at February to get our budget adopted before that deadline. And big part of that is the CIP. So really, you know, we talk about our budget cycle really starts with goal setting. You know, having council kind of give us some overall parameters about the CIP, property tax increases, and so we do that. Then we develop the CIP because obviously that's going to have an impact on the budget. And then in February, you'll have me back talking about the budget.
Thank you.
Now, what I really wish is that construction seasons would follow our fiscal year. That would just make things like so much easier, right, Lisa?
Anyone else from council? Mr. Whelan?
Thank you. Ash tree removal and replacement, we do that if it involves city property and there's
Correct.
a safety issue. If there's a tree on private property that could create a safety problem for people in the city, such as branches overhanging a sidewalk or something, do we have any obligation or can we take any action? And
Well, I
do
know,
we budget for
I
it?
know Mark can probably attest to that they probably get several calls about them when they're on private property. And so, Mark, I don't know if you have any comments you want to make about it or where we kind of determine that, or?
We have a provision, excuse me, in our ordinance that requires property owners to remove dangerous trees. And with the Emerald Ash Borer, of course, we're taking care of that on public property. But we have been proactive within our department, not only trying to notice those ourselves as they start declining, but to be very responsive to neighbors who want us to inspect some of their neighbors' trees to see if they are at the point where they have to be taken down. So far, we've been very fortunate that we've had voluntary compliance with removing private trees, but in the next 2 or 3 years, they're going to come fast and furious. But our code enforcement staff and our park and public works staff is keeping an eye on that.
Thank you.
Anyone further from council or P&Z members? Not seeing anything. Thank you very much for your
All right.
presentation, you and
Thank you.
staff. And I'll move real quickly here before we wrap things up. Council, is there a motion to allow bills and payroll?
So moved.
Second.
Motion second, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion carries. And again, I'd like to extend our appreciation for our volunteers at P&Z for all that you do, for the heavy lifting you do for council in the city. The time invested, I really do appreciate that. This will conclude our committee meeting this evening. We'll have the regular scheduled meeting at the top of the hour. Thank you.